Hey there YouTube family, welcome back to a brand new hour-long painting lesson. Today we're going to be painting a moose out in a foggy forest. And this painting, I feel like it shares a fair number of commonalities with paintings we've done in the past. It's a landscape, I do love those misty scenes. However, today we are going to improve upon that. We're going to add to it by also incorporating some wildlife with our little moose friend here. And I think this is a great size. I think this is a great subject to kind of introduce ourselves to that sort of thing. And then from there, in future paintings, we can build and do more wildlife. So that is what we are working on here today. As per usual, I'd like to quickly talk about all of our materials, and then we'll jump into the actual painting process. So let's begin with the canvas here. It is 9 by 12 inches. The drawing is already done on here, and it was done with these woodless colored pencils. I love these. I am not sponsored. I am not affiliated in any way. I just think they're a fantastic product that makes my drawing process so much more easy. And I like them because they allow me to allocate different colors to different subjects. So here I have my grid. It's done in a red, the moose is in a brown, the trees are in a green, the waterfall is in a blue, and it helps me allocate these different colors to these different subjects and keeps things simple and organized. That way my line work doesn't become cumbersome or confusing. They're also great because they are semi-erasable if you don't press too hard, and because they don't dilute pigments that are a little bit more vulnerable, like yellows, like a charcoal or a graphite might. Now, in regards to the drawing, it is a wildlife drawing, which means it is inherently going to be a bit more detailed. And for those of you who are here for painting and you're not too interested in the drawing process, don't you worry, I did add the gridded traceable up over on Patreon, as well as the reference photo to help you just get it on the canvas as quickly as possible without having to worry about proportioning and all of that. I personally love to use the gridded version of it. It helps me, again, make it easier and make sure everything's where it should be. For those of you, I suppose, who are new to the channel and unaware, Patreon is a great way to say thank you, to support the channel, but it's also a great way to get plenty of extra bonus rewards. By signing up over there, you can get the traceables and reference photos for all of the new hour-long lessons posted to YouTube each and every week. That way, again, you never have to worry about the proportioning or any of that. You get a back catalog of over 50 bonus hour-long lessons. I add new ones to it each and every month, and they come with traceables as well to help you, again, make that drawing process easier. A lot of them are wildlife related, so if you like this type of subject matter, you'll probably be very happy with a lot of the catalog up there as well. On there, I also have an exclusive Facebook group where we all share our work, help each other out, and this is a great way for you to kind of get your images in front of me, ask for critiques if you'd like. I also do one-on-one video critiques as an option as well, so you can go and check that out. There is plenty of really fun stuff up over on Patreon. It does help keep the lights on, so if you'd like to say thank you, if you'd like to ensure that this show continues, that's a great way of doing so. But with that, let's get back to the actual materials. So here I have a small dish of water. This is great for cleaning my brushes, getting that extra paint off. I have a small painting mat here. This is to wipe off that excess water and that excess paint as well. Here I have a palette, which is actually just a picture frame. I like it because it's very easy to clean and because pigments don't sink into it. From there, I have 5 brushes. Starting with my larger flat-headed brush. It is 2 centimeters wide, so it can carry a good amount of paint, but it also has this nice sharp edge for creating detail. Then I have a medium-sized flat-headed brush. It is 1 centimeter wide, so it's half the size. So when we get into slightly more detailed areas, this is a great piece to move to. Then I have a smaller flat-headed brush. This one is only half a centimeter, and this is great for the really minute, detailed, sharp areas. Then I have 2 round-headed brushes. This one's the medium-sized one. And as you can tell, it doesn't have any actual sharp line work on it, which makes it great for creating soft applications and blends. Then for the very finite, small applications and blends, here I have my smaller round-headed brush. So that is essentially all I'm going to be using. 4 brushes, very quick, very easy, very simple, just the basics. And then speaking of basics, here I have my paints. And these are really just for the start of the painting. It is Liquitex Basics, the brand. I really like it. It's a bit more thick than normal paints, I find, and I don't have to do as much layering. So with that said, let's talk about the actual paints that are here. So this is a Mars Black, this is a Titanium White, and I'm using these two to paint the entire base layer of the painting because I'm going to do so with the achromatic palette. And the achromatic palette is when you use white, black, and grays. You do this because it helps you allocate depth in your painting much more easily. Light and depth in painting are created when light is wrapped around a subject, so you get a gradient from light to dark, and that is most easily achieved when you are just working with white and black, because you don't have to worry about the colors and the hue in there as well. As soon as you start adding color, you start adding preconceived notions of which colors are bright and dark. I think a lot of us innately think of yellow as a bright pigment, when in all actuality, all colors have both bright and dark variants of them. So by eliminating that in the first layer, we get to really focus on the depth and make sure that we have a truly atmospheric, three-dimensional, realistic piece. And so we do our first layer in black, white, and gray, and then once it's fully done on here, we're going to let it dry entirely, then we're going to come back and do a glaze with a bunch of actual colors. Now, the colors will be listed in the video description, so you can go and see those. I'm personally not sure what I'm going to choose yet, which is why I don't disclose that immediately, but you can go and check it out down in the description, where you can also find the link to the Patreon and all of that. But that is essentially how we're going to go about this. If you haven't tried glazing before, don't you worry, I will explain it. If you haven't worked with the achromatic palette before, don't worry, I will explain it. But we're going to have a lot of fun, we're going to learn a lot, and we're going to come out with a piece that we all love and appreciate. So, let us get started and have a great time. So as you can see, I've kind of cleaned up my workspace a little bit here. Now I have my Titanium White and my Mars Black, and we're ready to get into the painting. I'm going to begin the painting with my larger flat-headed brush. Again, this one is 2 centimeters wide. I'm going to use this because I'm going to begin in the background here, and it's a lot of space to cover, so I want a large brush to do so. Now I'm going to begin, as I always do, by dipping the tip of my brush into the water. And this is going to do a couple of things. The first, it's going to kind of condense all of the bristles so that I don't have any loose stray ends to it, and that way I get a consistent stroke. And I get this water, and then I wipe it off up here, and then I wipe it off down here, and what I get in the end is a fairly damp brush. So now, when I take this brush and I add it to the paint, it interjects that wetness into the paint, and it makes them wet for a longer period of time, and it helps me drag paints farther as well. So a lot of benefits from doing this. I try not to go too deep with the water though, otherwise it will rise up here and kind of get into the glue with the bristles, and we don't want that. So I just want a minimal amount on the tip of the brush. Now I'm going to begin by using the corner of my brush and taking a good amount of Titanium White and putting it over here on the palette. And I'm going to begin up here with this very foggy background. It's going to be bright at the top, it's going to get a little bit darker at the bottom. So I need a bit of Mars Black now to make it a gray instead of a pure white. And I'm only grabbing a hint of Mars Black. As you can see, it's on the corner of my brush. And then I'm blending that into the Titanium White. And I'm doing this like so. I'm trying to make sure that the pigment doesn't end anywhere on here, so I want it to be consistently gray. I don't want one area of the brush to be black, another to be white. I want it to be a consistent gray. And now I'll take this and I'll apply it up here at the top. And I essentially want to apply my brightest pigment at the top. Now I like this pigment a lot, but I think it may be a little bit too dark, so I'm just going to adjust, take a bit more Titanium White, mix that in there, make sure that it's a nice smooth mixture. Again, we don't want lots of variables in what the color is on the side of the brush, so I just make it as bright as I can, and this is much nicer. It's going to blend with the pigment I just applied, so it'll make it a little bit darker, but that's okay. It's certainly brighter, and that's what I wanted. And then once I have that pigment that I want, I'm just going to start blending it down like this. And once I start to run out of excess paint, you'll see that it starts to get a little bit more chalky. You can see that granular effect that the canvas renders. That is a good sign that you need to go back to your palette and grab more paint, because this means that we're not going to get a fully applied layer. So as I get farther down, I want it to be a little bit darker. The lights up here can only pass through so much mist. We're starting to get shadows from the trees in the atmosphere. So I'll take a little bit more Mars Black and I'll work that into my mixture. Then from there, I'll apply this right underneath and I'll blend it up. And I'll go over that blend very softly. The more pressure you apply with your brush, the more line work you'll get in your stroke. And if you want something to be smooth, a really soft gradient, you don't want to apply a lot of pressure. Just let it glide on the canvas, go back over it a couple times, and you'll get to where you want to go. Now I'm going to clean off my brush a little bit. And I'm going to mix a good amount of extra paint. I cleaned off my brush, that way I didn't take any extra Mars Black in that brush and put it into the titanium white and dilute it. I'll take a little bit more Mars Black, I'll mix that up. And I'm mixing more of this rather than just spreading about what I had and using that, because it can be so easy and detrimental to kind of just move around the paint you have, because as you do that, you make your layers more thin than they should be, and you progressively run out of paint and have kind of a splotchy painting. And that's not what any of us want. So here, I'm going back, I'm remixing, and you can see that I'm starting to go over my tree drawings a little bit. That's okay, I can always go back to the traceable or the reference photo to redraw them in. But I don't want to leave open white areas along the trees. I might also be able to see through a little bit of this paint. If it's thin enough, the water will thin the paint to a point and make that semi-doable. Now I'm going to take some of this, head over here, and as you can see, right next to that bright pigment, this is quite a stark difference. So we'll need to do that blend. I'll allow the top area over here to be a little bit more dark gray than over here. That way we have a gradient going down and going this way. And we'll get a slight vignette effect in the painting, which will draw the eye more into the center. A vignette is just a darker edge that surrounds a picture or a painting, and it moves the eye inwards because the eye innately goes to the brightest point of any piece. Here I'm just going over this area time and time again, smoothing it out, taking out those brush strokes. I am generally a fan of brush strokes in paintings. I do feel like it's nice to look at an acrylic painting or an oil painting and say, you know, that's a painting, and I like that medium. However, I know that not all of us do so. I try to make these a little bit more smooth for those of you who like that slightly more realistic style rather than that kind of painterly effect. So anyways, here I'm just kind of cleaning my brush, as you can see. I'll grab some more titanium white, put that in there, and I'm going to come back up to the top and just extend this a little bit more. I'm going to try to work around the heart of the tree here, but I will go over all of the foliage. This will just make it relatively easy to go back and figure out where everything is. Then I'll work it back into here and down. You can see that it's making the background a little bit brighter, which is just fine. And it's also a great lesson in that you can continue to edit your backgrounds. When we're working with water here, our backgrounds are going to stay wet significantly longer, and that'll allow us to continuously go back and fix things and kind of change your values until you get exactly what you want. And even if they do start to dry, you can start doing a wet into dry application, but because, again, your new pigment is so wet, it'll be able to go over it with a fairly transparent layer and dissipate, so you'll have a very opaque start, let's say, when you first apply it, and then as you move down, it'll become more watery because you'll start to run out of paint, your brush will still be damp, and then as you move down, it'll dissipate, it'll get more transparent, more clear, and then you'll get the other color that you had initially on there showing up underneath, so it'll be a nice transition. Now here, I am just going back and I'm doing some extra layering. I'm making sure that I don't have any open areas. I don't have anything that looks a little bit too gritty. Going over these areas soft, with soft strokes for the most part. This got a little bit gritty right there, so what I'm going to do to remedy that is I'm going to go in with a little bit more of a wet brush. Just move that softly on top a couple times, and there you go. It's all fixed. Nice and easy. Here I can take that nice bright pigment, move it down a little bit more. Don't be afraid to take it to the edge. There we go. Now I'm going to take off that paint. I'm going to stand up and take a couple steps back. And this is something I'd advise everybody to do, just to make sure that your gradient's moving the way you want to. When you are really up close to the painting, sometimes it can be difficult to see just how it's moving. But when you take a step back, when you remove yourself, it becomes significantly more easy. And I think that's going really well. Now I want to move it down a little bit more. So I'm going to go back to mixing up this dark gray. I'll take a hint of this Mars black, work it into the gray. I'm going to go back and forth, because if you look at my brush right now, I have a little bit of Mars black right there, and it's more gray over here, so it wouldn't be a consistent application. So here I'm just blending it out, making sure it is consistent, and then I'll apply this right here. Now, your pigment might not be perfect upon first application, because of course you just went in to remix it. But we'll give it a shot, see what it looks like. I think this is good, it's just a little bit maybe too bright, so I'll add a hint more Mars black. Blend that out. And now I'll work that in. Blend it back up. And I'll also paint around my mousse. I'm using the small corner of my brush to create those really detailed areas and lines. There we go. Again, if I go over a little bit too much of it, I'm not concerned. I'm always able to go back and just check on my references. There we go. Now, there isn't really any gradient here. We've extended this part fairly far down at this point, and I'm continuing to do so, as you can see. But we don't have a gradient. We're not blending with any brighter pigment, which means we essentially just have this hard stop line, and that's something that you might miss when you're very close. But again, you stand up, you take a couple steps back, you notice it. So, I'm going to take a little bit more titanium white, put that into our mixture. As you can tell, it's not changing it much, but then I can go back, apply that, work it softly over everything, back and forth. I head downwards, and just like that, I have a gradient yet again. Now it's kind of a little bit darker right here than it is there, so I'm going to take a little bit more titanium white, just fix that up. Again, nice and easy, everything's still, in the very least, damp and malleable. There we go. So now it really looks like there's this light behind this mist right up here, and then as you get farther down, maybe there's some trees here and some more trees, and it gets darker and darker, you get more shadows, and we essentially just establish depth. I like to work on the backgrounds like this to begin with, because it's a large area, it's a lot of blending, and it's a great way to practice your actual brush stroke. when a lot of us take a week off in painting, maybe we have a busy week and we don't get to it, we can kind of lose some of those fine motor skills and we need to get them back. That can be done fairly easily. Generally, it only takes 10-15 minutes, and doing something like a large sky is a great way to do that. I also like to do the skies first because it allows me to layer everything on top of them. So this is so far a great start. I'm very, very happy with how this is all going. I'm just going to take a couple steps back, make sure it's what I want it to be, and it's exactly what I want. So we can continue to progress. Now, I like to work in the backgrounds, and I work on the subject that's the farthest away, and then the next object that's the farthest away, and I continue like that until we get into our foreground. That way, when we get to our main subjects, we are very well practiced. So here, I'm going to work on this set of trees in here. They're very, very foggy. There's a lot on top of them. We're not going to see a lot of detail, but what they are going to be is a little bit darker than the rest of the sky. As you move closer to us, we see more contrast. We see brighter brights, darker darks generally. So as I get a little bit closer, I'm going to see slightly darker darks. So I'm going to take some Mars black, work that into my mixture. Going to start here at the bottom while I have a good amount of paint. I'm doing a little bit of a tapping motion, that way I keep the edge of this set of bushes and trees fairly loose. That way it doesn't end up being a hard edge and confusing later on. Mix up some more of that paint as I started to run out. And when I mix my paint over and over again, I try to leave a little bit of the pre-existing mixture on the edge. That way I can see what I'm mixing towards, and that way I have a direct example of what it is. It's a little bit too bright. I'll grab some extra Mars black. There we go. That's what we want. Now here I have my tree. I'm not going to work all the way around all of these little branches. That's okay. I will just keep that middle part, that way I know where it is. And then I'll start to move upwards. Now as I get towards the edge, I want a little bit more of a foliage effect. These trees are fairly far away, so you won't see a lot of detail. A lot of that detail is also going to be hidden by the fog. So we're going to want to be a little bit more playful with how we apply it. And I'm just going to do this little tap and drag effect with my brush. And this is going to create the effect of randomized leaves in the distance, randomized foliage, there we go. Here you can see I'm rotating my brush in the air before I go back in for that tap. And then I kind of blend it down into the rest of what we had. Go back, grab some more pigment. I'll define the edges of this tree first. Make sure that's nice and solidified. Then I'll come back up and I'll just create more of that edging. It's a really nice cathartic way of painting. It's very loose. I'm also trying to make sure that this isn't perfect. I'm kind of still tapping in that. I'm moving my brush in different directions, and that way it looks like there's different clusters of foliage and different leaves and all of that kind of occurring in that same space. Now as I get down into here, I really want this value to get lost in this value. I want it to look like the fog, the mist, is kind of coming over and overtaking this. And the best way of going about that is to take the color of the mist and move it and blend it into that. So it's a little bit brighter. I'll take some extra titanium white, move that in there. Start tapping and applying that to the edge. I can even blend it a little bit into the background here. See that? Starts to get lost, looks really nice. And then I'm taking that highlight and I'm just kind of tapping in all of this extra texture. Maybe that's a little opening in the tree and you can see the sky in behind. Create some more of those little openings with this lighter value up here. I'm trying to be very random with it. I want lots of different implications. Nothing too definitive. And then I'm just kind of building it up from this side out into here until we have what we want. Now I'm allowing the top area to be a little bit brighter, which is why I'm going over it with the slightly brighter pigment. But the bottom area I want to remain as dark as it is, because I want the light to come in from the top, touch, graze the tops of all of these trees, and then as we get lower, it dissipates, less light gets there, there are more shadows cast in that area. So we want it to get softer. But up here, we can use those light values. We can create that subtle change between the foggy top and the trees. There we go. Now it's really getting lost. Very undefined, which is exactly what we want in the background. If you made every area of your painting hyper detailed, then A, it wouldn't look like there was fog in any of it, but you also wouldn't be able to draw attention to your main subjects. So a big part of painting is restraint, and it's not applying all of your detail everywhere. It's recognizing when and where to do so. So now I'm going to take a couple of steps back again, just see how it's looking. I like it. I think that something we need to avoid is making it too simple. Don't just make it a straight line. Have little bumps and divots. And you know what? I should probably go back in and add a couple more little divots, things like that. So I'll take a bit more of that lighter pigment. And that's just because diversity is so important even in the more simple areas. Grab a hint more Mars Black. I think I went a little bit too bright there. Try that. It's a little bit too dark. Grab some more titanium white. It's all about trial and error and being honest with yourself, asking, is this too dark? Is this too light? Okay, how do I make it to the value that it was in the sky? And you just kind of problem solve until you get that answer. Here you see I found that color of the sky, or that value in the sky, and now I'm able to just kind of work on these extra highlights. Change the divots, make it a little bit more natural looking. There we go. Now again, taking a couple of steps back, looking at it, and that is a little bit more interesting. You can see now how it kind of divots, and works that way. Now again, I don't want this to be too detailed. I do have a lot more detail coming here in the foreground. I think I'm going to brighten the top of it a little bit more. That way we have a bit more of a gradient. But it's all just trial and error. I have my canvas taped with green painter's tape to the easel. That way I can do this more loose tapping effect and not worry about my canvas kind of jumping around on me. So here you can see I'm working it down. As I get farther down, I'm allowing it to dissipate. I'm getting even softer with my stroke, that way it's less prevalent. Just like so. And that looks like it has a lot more depth now. at least up close. Again, the true test is from a couple of steps back. Something else you could do if you didn't have a lot of space in your studio is use a mirror to hold it up. That'll give you a fresh perspective, or take a picture on a smartphone and look at it there. It'll be completely resized and it'll give you, again, that fresh perspective you need. Now from there, let's continue working on this side. Let's move a little bit further, and that means, again, getting a little bit darker. So here I have some more Mars black, work that into my gray. I'll start with that same tapping effect. And we're starting to move out of the mist now. So we can get a little bit more texture. We can get a little bit more of those leaves showing. So here, again, I'm getting to that edge. I'm doing that tapping motion, but I'm not trying to blend as much of them. I'm also trying to use the corner of my brush to create these little leaf effects, as you can see. Nice and easy. This will be one of the darker areas of our canvas. We're continuing to give it this kind of vignette effect where the middle will be, again, the brighter area in contrast to the very dark mousse. Here I'm mixing up some more paint. I'll use the sharp edge of my brush for the first time and just kind of cut around this nice couple of sharp rocks here. That way we don't go over them, we know exactly where they are. Another big benefit of this brush that we haven't really had the opportunity to use yet in this lesson, because we're working with much more organic but also combined shapes. Lots of these leaves that are amalgamating in the distance. And I will allow this to kind of trail off into the back like we did the rest. Have some areas that kind of get higher and then lower. Again, just creating more of that interesting structure that we had with this. Now this, for the most part, is a singular value, right? It doesn't have a gradient, it doesn't move from light to dark, and therefore it looks flat and non-three-dimensional. So we'll add a little bit of 3-dimension to it by taking some extra titanium white, putting that into our mixture, and then I just come down and I'll make sure this kind of matches what we have up here, because that's what we want, and then I'll move this in to around the top. I'll do these little taps, and I'm not using the full head of the brush, because if I do, I get something that's much more linear. I'm trying to get something instead that's a little more randomized. So here I'm using more of the corner of my brush and rotating it slightly as I continue to move. And then as I get farther and farther away, I'm doing more of a blend. And I'm pressing a little bit harder, that way my bristles expand outwards and I don't get these more sharp impressions that I was getting there. There we go. Worked quite well, quite easily. And if you find you make it too bright, don't you worry, you can always go back in and make it a little bit darker. So from there, let's continue working on this side because it won't disrupt anything else in the painting. From there, I think I'm going to switch over to my smallest flat-headed brush. Again, this one is 1/2 centimeter and it's great for the really detailed areas. Now I'm going to take a gray that's fairly similar to what we have right there, so I'll take a little bit more Mars black, work that in. I'm going to take my pinky finger, rest it on an area of the canvas that is either entirely dry or void of paint. This is going to help me take the shake out of my hand. And I'm going to create this long, nice base here for my tree. I'm pressing very, very lightly. The more pressure I add, the more the bristles will expand and the larger of an application I will create. So I'm just making it very soft right now. There we go. Let's try making it a little bit darker. It's starting to blend. I think I just blended a little bit too much with titanium white here on the palette. There we go, beautiful. I think I'm going to make it a little bit higher than I have it on my reference photo. There we go. And now I get to kind of create all of my foliage that comes out. So there's a bit of a technique to this. At the top of your tree, your foliage, your branches are going to kind of dip down a little bit. And then if they're light, if they don't have a lot of foliage on them, they're going to come back up. It's kind of like an arm reaching down and then back up. And then I'm using the corner of the brush to create all of these little details. Now, in this, there's also a great lesson in that these aren't right next to each other. Create diversity in your branches, change the shape, the size, but also how they protrude from your tree. Now, also importantly, branches don't just grow to the left and to the right of how we're looking at trees. They grow forwards and backwards and diagonally. So let's incorporate something that's a little more diagonal. Let's say this one's going more forwards towards us. It'll overlap this other one. Here, I'll create another small one. And you can see just playing with it. As we get farther down in the tree, the branches start to get a little bit bigger. And as they get bigger, they get heavier. So here, it'll dip down, and then it won't come all the way back up. It won't be a bell shape, it'll more even out. So here it's going straight, some of the little extra branches are going to go up, some of them are going to go down, but as a whole, it's not leafing back up as it once was. I'm going to take a little step back, just make sure that things are progressing as they should be. So far, so good. Also, occasionally checking to see that the monitor of the camera is working well through the light and dark patches. It's one of those days that's cloudy here and then it's sunny there, and that can change how you see the canvas and the values a little bit. So just trying to make sure that that's consistent. The best way to paint is on a consistently cloudy day or a consistently sunny day, but you can learn a lot about painting by painting on days that are kind of going back and forth, because you see the painting in warm and cool light, and you can see it in both bright and darker situations, which is what we're doing here today. Here, this branch, it comes from here, it overlaps this one, and then it's coming down. And then I'm having these little areas just kind of leaf off. Then have another one, have it branch out, have something kind of going in front, coming back up. Trying to be fairly random with it, but I'm also taking my time for the most part and making smart applications. That way, again, it's diverse. Sometimes when you just go really quickly, you can get a nice loose effect, but you can also kind of fall into these ideas that we kind of store in our heads of simplified subjects. So we kind of go back to our basic ideas of what a tree looks like, and then every branch looks the same, and that can be an issue. Which is why it's great to work from a reference photo, which I'm peeking over at and just seeing how they progress. I'm not doing it in the same way, but I'm using it to get extra ideas so that I don't just work with my own, again, preconceived notions of what a tree is and looks like. This branch is coming off of this one over here on the left side, and it's crossing over the middle, and then it's ending up over here on the right side, which is an interesting effect. There we go. Just going back, touching up other little areas that can have extra strands of foliage, all of that. And then as I get closer to the bottom, they start to get heavy. They have a lot of foliage on them, they have a lot more branch, and so they don't start to leaf up. They kind of just leaf back down again. There we go. And eventually they'll get lost down here. Underneath the rocks and the bushes and all of that. And the value will get lost into this darker value because again we used something that was very similar intentionally, and now we have something that's nice and cohesive. It all blends together right there. So from there, I'm going to take a couple of steps back, make sure that it's going well. Now that we're done our tree, we're going to move down into this bush and rock area because it's the next thing that's forward in our painting. So for this, I'm actually going to move over to the medium-sized flat-headed brush. This one is 1 centimeter wide, and I like this one because it can fill in these semi-larger areas but with a sharp line. So here I'm going to begin by working on the bush because it's kind of in the farthest area and it's going to be quite dark. So I'll grab some extra Mars black, some titanium white, mix those two together here on the palette. I do want it to be a little bit darker than our tree, just a hint. That way it shows that it's in front of it. And I'm going to begin on the edges with this nice little tapping effect as we have. I'm going to cut around my rocks. There we go. I'll cut around these ones, but as you can see, it started to get very chalky. I didn't have enough paint, so I wasn't going to get a smooth line. So I grabbed some extra water, some extra paint, and now I can just kind of cut along that edge. Paint in the middle. I'm using a slight tap and drag effect here, that way I get something that's semi-inconsistent. Create a little bit more over here. Just make it interesting. There we go. Now this part, it kind of trails off into the background, and the background's much lighter, so I want to make that a bit lighter. So I'll take some titanium white, mix that in, and I just wanted to match the background a little bit better, to kind of get lost in there, just as this did in there. And then it moves into that nice dark value that we have here in the foreground. There we go. Now we can start working on our rocks, which will also be quite dark. So think about this. The light's coming in like this. So the tops of our trees have been a little bit brighter, the bottoms have been a little bit darker, but now we're working with a subject that has a front and a back, and that is this rock. So the side that's facing the light, we can use a much brighter pigment. Here, I'll mix in a good amount of titanium white. I'll cut in that edge. I'll cut in the edge for the front of it. And we'll just move that like so. We can do the same to this other rock that's more in the foreground. That's really nice. Now, as we get to the other side of them, the side that isn't receiving as much light, I'm going to take a lot more Mars black, work that in, and now we start by cutting in that edge. I work that in here, create the back of this rock, and it's quite dark. And I'm doing this to again just create that depth. Now, of course, there can be little breaks in the rock, there can be blends, as you can see here. Doesn't have to be a perfectly sharp application. In fact, it'll look more realistic and interesting if it has some little taps and movements in there. I can create a little bit of a light shelf in this one as well. Kind of comes up. But essentially, the sides that are touching the light up here are going to be much brighter than the sides that are opposite to that are going to be much darker. Here I have some extra foliage that's kind of moving its way on in front of this rock. So I just use the corner of my brush to create all of these little impressions of leaves. Now we're quite close to us and we can have that detail. Create a little bit more back here. And this was going to be a rock. I think it still will be. I think it'll be a bit of a brighter rock. But not as bright as these, because it'll have more shadow. It's a bit farther away. It'll have this kind of blocking some of the light. But we're starting to get into the foreground, so we can start working with some real detail here. So I'm just creating little patches, little rocks here and there, and making it more interesting. Here, this rock has some fissures in it, little indents. You can put another little rock underneath it. And for those of you using the traceable, don't you worry, I've already drawn all of these into the traceable. The traceable depicted the final version of the painting, not the starting version, so you don't have to guess about where any of these go. There we are. Just keep adding them until I feel like adding more would make it messy. I'll do a little bit of a blend in this one down into the darker area, just like that. And then I'll switch over to my smallest round-headed or square-headed brush, flat-headed brush, and I will create a little bit of this lighter pigment, and we'll create some highlights on the bush here. So I'm just going to create lots of these little taps with the corner of the brush because it'll give me the finest impression. And as you can see, it's just a little bit of light hitting the tops of these bushes. It gives them some extra detail. We can even throw it in over here as well. I'm just creating the impression of lots of little leaves, and we can only do this really in the foreground because in the background you won't see that. It'll all get lost, and it'll get lost up here. So I'm starting down here because this is where it's closest to us, and then I'm just allowing my paint to dissipate naturally on my brush. So as I move up this way, I start to run out. I'm still running out. I get less and less detail, and it'll just make the most amount of sense. There you go, see? Starting to run out. It's not as stark as it is here. I'll create some small patches down here that are maybe sticking out a little bit, catching some extra light, but not too much. I have a little bit too much of a bright pigment there, so I'm just blending it out. And of course we can add hints of this to our tree, just throwing it on the side of the tree that's facing the light, on the heart of it. And then you can also add highlights to the branches, but don't go too crazy with this because you want the branches to remain nice and small, nice and subtle, and the more applications you put, you're probably going to widen it a little bit. So I'm just picking a couple very specific areas that I feel confident that I'm not going to extend the size of them. And I'm just applying this out there. There we go. And now we have a relatively detailed background already, which is looking quite good. Now, for this next step, we need to start working on this background over here, because I don't want to work on the foreground until we've done this background, because we layer the foreground on top of that background. But something I'm going to do, because we're going to be working around the moose a lot fairly soon, is I'm actually just going to do the moose in a silhouette of pure black. We'll go back in, we'll add depth to it later, but by doing this and letting it dry, we will essentially not lose the drawing of our moose. I'm okay with going back in and redrawing most everything else, but the moose does take quite a bit more time, and I just want to make sure that he's taken care of here. So, I'm going in with the smallest flat-headed brush. I'm following the edges while I have a lot of wet pigment on my brush, and then I go back in and I work on the inside area. The inside area is a lot easier to paint. It's a lot less stressful because you already have your sharp edges defined. Here we'll paint his little tail. Pretty adorable. When I was growing up, my parents would always take me to Algonquin Park. It's a really, really beautiful place, and the hope was always, as we were driving up, to see lots of moose. And the families. Parents always had a real love for nature. I suppose that's really followed me, especially into the artwork. There we go. Starting to really see the character here. We have a member of our community named Kyle Goody, who's a part of the Patreon, and we've talked a couple of times, and he posts his work up over on the Facebook page, and he recently posted a piece with a little bear in this really beautiful, vast landscape. And I was looking at it and I was like, wow, you did such a good job of putting all of this detail into such a little character, which was a big animal. And I found it really inspiring, so I figured we would try this moose here today. He really was the inspiration for this one. So thank you, Kyle, for the incredible support of the channel, but also for the inspiration as well. Nice to have such a talented community with us. Here you can see I'm going over a couple of areas more than once. And I'm doing that because the paint here is very watered down. And it's intentionally very watered down. That's allowing me to apply all of this as smoothly as I am and get those really nice sharp lines. But the cost of that is that the paint's really thinned. So here you can see a lot of that white showing through. And we need to cover that. There we go. The benefit of painting this all in a silhouette to begin with is that we really get to see the shape and the form. That way we know if we need to fix anything before we start getting complicated and adding color. If you find that you're trying to go over an area that's very wet and it's just not clicking, it's not working the way you want it to, take a little bit of a break, let it dry. Sometimes if it's too wet, it will just move around the paint more so than you want, and that really doesn't help the painting. So sometimes all we need is just a little bit of patience, and when you're working with acrylics, really all you need is a little bit because it's such a quick drying medium. that you really don't have to take too long of a break, which is great. Really want to spend some time on the antlers here. Make sure they're nice and detailed, nice and sharp. We used to get deer in our backyard when I was growing up, and my parents would always put apples out and feed them. And painting kind of brings me back to that a little bit. It's always nice when a painting can take you to a time and place, a memory. I think these nature and wildlife paintings do that for a lot of us. But anyways, that is a good version of our mousse. I'm going to let this mousse dry entirely. I think it'll only take 5, maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll come back in and we'll work on the backgrounds here. I just needed to make sure that that was solidified, so if we painted over parts of it, we'd still see this very dark pigment through it because acrylic paints are semi-transparent. You do generally see the really dark pigments through light pigments, so we should still see the outline should we happen to do that. So it'll let us paint a little bit more freely, and then we'll come back at the end of the painting and we'll paint in all of the detail and the volume to make this three-dimensional. So, I'm going to take a little break. I'm going to clean my water. I'm going to clean my brushes thoroughly. We've been cleaning them minorly by doing this, kind of taking off that excess paint, wiping it off, putting them over there. But we don't want any paint to dry kind of internally to bind to the bristles to make them a little bit stiff. I've had these brushes for a long time, and it's because I take care of them. So, let us clean our water, clean our brushes, wait 5-10 minutes, and then we'll be right back. So we are back. The mousse is dry, the brushes are clean, as is the water. And now I can jump back into the background area. Now here you can see there's this open space. It wasn't completed and it was purposefully left out because I didn't want it to interrupt any of the line work of the mousse before we could really solidify it. So with that, I'm now going to jump back in. I'm going to take the medium-sized flat-headed brush. Again, this one has 1 centimeter wide head. I'm going to make sure the edge of it is nice and damp. Then I'm going to head back, take a little bit of Mars Black, take about double that in titanium white, mix that into our grays, and we'll just kind of see where this fits. It's a little bit darker, put it right there. There we go. Now, as you can see, it's very watery. It's quite transparent. You can see through it to a great extent. So I'll mix up a little bit more in a different area of the palette. And this will hopefully give us a bit of a more thick application. We're not working with an incredibly detailed edge right here. Not quite yet anyway, so I didn't need anything to be that wet and that transparent. So here I'm just working it that way. And here it's going to be a waterfall. It's going to kind of trickle into here and have a couple smaller falls. So I'm just going to create a nice flat top for some of these, as you can see. And then I'm also going to work my way around the mousse. I'm just using the corner of my brush, doing the edges first, and then I'll come in and I'll fill in the middle. Now as I get higher, it does need to get brighter, so I'm just taking that dark pigment off of my brush, wiping off all of that excess water, take some titanium white, move that into our mixture that we were just working with, make it a little bit brighter, not too much. Here you can see I'm testing it, it blends right into that previous application, which is perfect. I'm going to begin by working around the edges of the mousse in that same way. We can move over it a little bit because we will see that dark pigment through this, but I might as well be as detail oriented as I can. It will make it a little bit easier later on if I successfully create those clean, sharp lines. Now I'm just going to do more of that little tapping effect to blend the two, make that nice soft transition. There we go. Nice and filled in. Easy. And from there, we can move on to the next part of our painting, which is yet again the background. So we're going to do this with a little bit of a mixture of this over here. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 trees to avoid. So we're going to have to be a little bit more careful than when we were doing this because we only had one tree. But again, I'm only going to worry about the middle part, and then I'll figure out the branches again in a little bit. So what I like to do here is, I noticed that this is a bit of a lighter gray. It's probably similar to what we used here, so I'll use that as my reference point. I'll start by grabbing a good amount of titanium white. I'll grab about 1/4 of that, maybe 1/5 of that in Mars Black. Mars Black is a much stronger pigment, so I want a significantly less amount. I'll mix that up, and it looks like that mixture was very close to what we had there. So now I can test this. Just do so here. So you can see it's actually significantly brighter. So I'll make it a little bit darker. Grab some extra Mars Black, not much. We'll slowly darken this. And I'll test that, and that's quite close, if not a little bit dark. Now I'm going to head over here, and I'll start by creating the edges that we have. And so I'm just using the corner of my brush. It's a bit of a tap, it's a bit of a drag, it's a very organic motion. Take a little bit of titanium white, brighten it up just a hint. And I'll follow that edge while the brush is still full of paint and good at doing what it is currently doing. Now here I have a waterfall. And that's really going to be behind all of this, but I want to do this roughly first, just to see what value I should allocate to that waterfall. So I'm doing this in more of a messy way because I've accepted that I'm going to paint over it. But I just want that same value in that area. Then I'll take this, I'll work it on the side of my trees, and then back in. Started to run out, so you can see all of that gritty effect. Grab some more paint. There we go. Grab some more. Good. Make sure we're still on track. I'll just test it over here. You can see that it blends in extremely well. It's a little bit brighter than what we have on the edges, which I think speaks to the fact that the edges were slightly darker than what I wanted. But that's okay, we can always go back over them, soften them again, do all the things that we've been doing. Yeah, it's very evident right here. But that's okay because we are working with acrylics and they're just so easy to paint over and fix. Don't be afraid to go back and fix something just because you've done a fair bit of it or because it's quote-unquote done. Your painting will be much better when you can be honest with yourself, go back, fix things, make improvements, figure out where your issues lie. Because if you leave one thing incorrect in your painting, you may relate other subjects to it in your painting visually, and it may lead them astray. So, an edge like this, going back, brightening it, will help us greatly in the long term, whether we realize it or not. There we go. Now as we get farther down, I want it to get slightly darker just as that did. Because the light, it's coming in, it's going to catch the tops of these, but the bottoms are going to be full of shadows, especially here. We have so much dense foliage. So I'm just grabbing extra Mars Black, working that into our current mixture, applying it to the bottom, and working it upwards. And then remember, as we start to move it up into the top, I don't want a soft blend. I want it to be this more tap and drag effect. That way it looks like the implication of clusters and foliage. This is a bit farther away. It's kind of in between these two. So I want a mixture of those two effects. So you can see that I'm slowly, and I do mean slowly, going back and grabbing more Mars Black and throwing that into our mixture. The more we do that, the more contrast we'll have. But I'm doing it slowly because it can quickly overwhelm our mixture, and I don't want it to become simply dark. I want to slowly build it up. The more little intermediate stages we can create here, the more interesting it's going to look. There we go. Started to cover up some of the tree there, but I am entirely okay with that. It was inevitable to a point. We still have enough of the structure there to continue to work with it. Slowly moving down, starting to make it darker and darker. But I'm still not making it truly dark because the bushes in the foreground and the foliage on the trees will be that true dark pigment. And if we make this background fully dark, then that won't show up. And we won't get that contrast that we want. The moose right now is a great example of what truly dark looks like. So we want to avoid that. Another benefit of doing the moose early, or at least the underlayer of the moose. Cleaning my brush well. Going to take a couple of steps back as we've done a good amount on it, and I just want to make sure it's coming along the way we want it to. And so far, so good. I like that a lot. It does feel like it's kind of in between. I do want to go back and soften these edges though, make them a little bit brighter. And this is where I'm going to take my medium-sized round-headed brush because it will create more of a soft effect. And this is great for distant foliage. So I begin by making sure this is nice and damp. Take a good amount of this titanium white, move it over into our gray, create a nice and bright mixture here. Want it to be between the sky and this, and that is exactly what I wanted. There we go. So I'm going to begin with this tapping slight swirl motion along the edges, as you can see. Works really well down here, it just starts to fade into that distance. Nice. And then I'll start moving it inwards a little bit. So this is again to create the implication of clusters of foliage and just kind of this fog that's rolling through, diffusing all of those harsh contrasts. There we go. And then as we get farther down, remember we let it dissipate. There are more shadows, it's supposed to get darker. But it added a little bit of extra volume to the painting. Added some extra detail. Softened a couple of things. And just like that, the painting is so much better for it. Now from there, I want to do the trees that we have here, and then I'll paint the bushes around / in front. So, for the trees, I'm going to begin with the medium-sized flat-headed brush. I was a little conflicted whether I wanted the small one or the medium one. I think these trees are a little bit larger. They're a little bit more in the forefront than this one, so I can go a little bit bigger, but I am going to be careful with this next application. So I want these trees to be a little bit darker than this, but again, not truly dark. So I'll grab some Mars Black, work that into our titanium white. I want my brush to be relatively damp for this because I want a very clean stroke. If that means I have to go back and do a couple of layers, that's okay. And for this, just going to begin here at the bottom, start working my way up. If there's a little bit of white left on the sides, that's not a great thing, but you can cover it up later on with foliage. Don't make the tree itself larger to cover it up, especially not in the first application. Make the first application of the tree nice and small, and then as you continue to make it, then you can kind of feel it out and see if you want to make it larger. It's much easier to make it larger. It's very difficult to make it small again. I feel like we could make this one a little bit bigger. So I'll come down, I'll just fill in a little bit of this. I'll apply a little bit more pressure with my brush, which will expand the bristles, which will give me a slightly more dominant application. I'm going over everything twice because, again, the paint was relatively thin. Now I'll do another one right here. And you can see it's getting lost into the darker areas of the woods, which is actually a good thing. It makes it look like it's cohesive within this atmosphere. And something else I'd like to advise, trees generally don't grow completely straight up, so I try to add a hint of a bend into them here and there. And another way of not making it look like a straight line, but giving it a little bit more character, is to kind of go back, or in the initial application, tap on these kind of middle areas, because it'll give it a slightly more rough segmented texture, which is great for indicating bark and that sort of thing. So here you can see, rather than doing a stroke, I'm tapping on this edge. This one's the closest to us, so it'll be the most dominant. So you see the most detail in the bark. As they get farther and farther away, doing a line is fine, because you won't see that texture or that detail from such a far away tree. There we go. And I'll bring this down. And you know what, I'll just take this pigment and I'll kind of create a bush right here, a dark one. Doing that with that same tap, using the corner of my brush. Very similar techniques to what I used up there. Now there's another tree right here, but it's a bit farther away, so I want it to be a little bit brighter. So I'll take some extra titanium white for this mixture. Won't have it as dark as the ones that we have to the sides. This will give it some extra depth, the painting as a whole, but also the sets of trees. And this one I have leaning a little bit more that way. And then I'll have it getting lost into the foliage here. Some of these trees are going to exist in front of these bushes, some in, some behind, some back in other trees. And that's another way to instigate diversity in your paintings. There we go, though. Now, when we start to create the foliage for all of these, we are going to not necessarily run into an issue, but if we start up here and then we move down here, it'll start to overlap the waterfall, but we need to paint that waterfall before we do that. Now, I accepted that when I was painting this right here, the waterfall would cover it. It's farther back behind. So we're going to go back. We're going to do the waterfall now that I have a good eye for what values we're using. I want the waterfall to be bright, maybe around this value right here. Not the brightest, but fairly bright. And I'm doing that because it'll create a contrast with my moose here, and he'll really pop and stand out in relation to it because it'll be this very bright thing and then this very dark thing. So for that, I'll take some of our titanium white, mix it, and I'm using my reference, which is right here. This is the pigment we used for the side of the foliage that was brighter, and I'm just going to try to make it a little bit brighter than that. And then I'll come in like so. And I'm using a bit of a tap here along the edge. I don't want it to be a perfectly smooth edge. I want the water to look like it's coming in and it's kind of rushing off and it's hitting edges and it has all of these different interesting movements. Just a hint of Mars black, a good amount of titanium white. Going to use that sharp edge around my mousse. You can see that the pigment wasn't properly placed evenly across my brush. I have a little bit of Mars black there and it shows right there. So I'm going to blend that out. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to move this up kind of in these vertical applications with a little bit of a bend in them. That way it looks like the water is kind of rushing. So you can use this to your advantage, use your inconsistencies to an advantage. Just make it look like the water is kind of falling and running. And here I'm doing a bit of a tap so that it looks like it's kind of jumping off a little bit. It'll give it more of a rushing effect. There we go. I'm covering up a lot of the foliage that we have here on the side, excepting that I'm just going to redo it. Going in between the legs here, using the corner of my brush to paint it. I covered up a little bit of the leg. That's okay. I can see where it's meant to be repainted. But this is why it was important that we did the outline and the silhouette of the mousse to begin with. There we go. There we are. You notice it gets a little bit darker as we move down towards the bottom. That's good. It makes it look like, again, there's more shadow in that area. But let's go back in and add some highlights to it. And for that, I'll take my smaller square-headed brush, add some extra titanium white to our current mixture, and then I can go to the tops of these little pieces of falling water and I can apply a little bit of a lip. And this is the part where the light is hitting, and then it falls. And because it's falling, it's opposite to the light. So we'll just do a little bit of that highlight coming down, but not much at all. I'm just dragging hints of it, just like so. Can also move that highlight back up into here. I don't want the waterfall to be too detailed because it is relatively far away. Just want enough to make it recognizable. Then I will mix up a little bit of a darker gray, something I would assume would be similar to this, and then I'll just apply these little pieces of foliage back on top. There we go. Nice and easy. I'll also take a little bit of Mars black and just fix up the edging on my mousse a little bit as well. Again, very easy process because of the initial work we put in. I'm going to take a couple of steps back and just make sure the value of that is essentially what I want it to be. So, all is well, and I'm going to continue now. Because I stepped back, I realized that I could have a little bit of water kind of trickling in over here from the side, and that'd be a really nice added detail. So I'm just going to mix up a bit more of that highlight. I had a hint of it over here so I could use as a reference. And I'm just going to have this working in little streams that come down and eventually mix with the water that's kind of accumulatively falling here. We can even make a little flat spring for it. And this will add some detail. Show that water is coming from multiple areas. There, I'm just going back and fixing up a couple areas as well. Because we're applying a light pigment over a dark pigment, this is going to appear a little bit darker because it is semi-transparent. So you might want to go over a couple areas a couple of times, but recognize the more that you go over it, the more thick it will become, and you don't want it to become too thick. There we go. Just like that, we have a bunch of extra detail. Now, going to just take a little look back. Still good? Okay. I'm going to move into these trees and start doing what I did over here. So I'm going to begin at the tops. That way I can progressively make it larger. I'm going to start with some of this Mars black, a little bit of titanium white. I want a similar value to what we have on the trunk of the tree. So I'll test this. I'll just do a little tap inside, make sure that it's similar. It is, and that means I can go back to here. And I can still see a little bit of my drawing, which is great. It means I don't have to get out the traceable or any of that. And I'm starting this time from the edge, and I'm creating this little line. I'll show you. Starting from the edge, creating this line, using the corner of my brush to do so, bringing it up into here, kind of creating this large U shape, and then I'm just dragging little bits of this out to create these extra nice little branches. Here, one's happening kind of in front of it, which is nice. There's a very small one. And I'm bringing it up past the top to show scale. So here again, starting with the corner, this time I started in closer to the tree rather than out, and it gives you a little bit more of a speckled effect generally, more of a pitter-pattery effect. Neither is necessarily right or wrong, it's just about how you like to create. Here I will make one go in front / behind these two, which will make that much more interesting. And I'm bouncing back and forth between my two sides, trying to diversify. This will go in front of the other tree, which will be interesting. And we're just trying to find more ways, again, to make it more interesting. It's a very, very simple goal. And diversity is consistently the answer. There we go. I'm going to start with one out here, and I'm doing this so that I know when I get to this point in the tree, this is how far out I want the branches to be. I don't want to start from here and then accidentally have it go too far by starting out here. I definitively set how far I'm allowing it to go, and then I can kind of work my way back in. And as I work my way back in, I'm doing more of this tapping effect, which is giving me more of this pitter-pattery application, which is giving me all of these very intricate different details, which is really nice for realism for these trees in the foreground. It doesn't work for ones that are farther away because you won't see this amount of detail, but when you get up close here, this is where you really get to have fun with it. Starting to get a little bit too light there, so I'll just go back in, mix a bit of a darker pigment, and then continue from there. Some of these trees will expand as they go towards the bottom. Other kinds will get a little bit smaller again. And we'll do that here just so that we don't go over the waterfall too much. These can be similar types of trees, but not the exact same kind. Slight different variations. Really trying to get them to overlap here at the bottom where it's a little bit more dense. And then here you can see that they're really just getting lost entirely down in that thick area. Mix up a bit more. And I did have another tree right here, so I'll paint that in. This one's a small one. It'll only really go up to there. It'll have a couple little branches. And this is one of those things where if you didn't see it painted, if you weren't here to see it painted, you probably wouldn't realize it's there. But it is this extra little detail that is nice for the painting. Now we'll start working on this one. And this time, it's a little bit farther away, so I'll incorporate a hint more titanium white. But I'm also not going to make it as full as this one. And I'm going to do that for two reasons. One, in the reference photo, it's not as full. Two, if we were to make it as full, it would look a little bit too complicated. It might overwhelm this area visually. We might lose the detail because everything would just start amalgamating and we wouldn't see any of the sky showing through. So here I'm actually just going to limit the branches that I have on it. They're still going to come and cross over with these to an extent, but it's going to be significantly less than what we had in our initial tree. And again, it'll just add some good diversity. Now some big clouds just came over the sun, so I'm going to check the screen and the camera and make sure things didn't get too dark. I think I have it set so when a big cloud comes, it just makes everything look a little bit more blue rather than actually getting dark, which is good. But with that, we can continue. There we are. I think that's actually good. I don't think we need to do any more than that. I like that we can see the middle of the tree showing through. It's a nice effect. Next we'll do this one. It also is a little bit farther back, so it has a bit more titanium white in it. And I'll have bits of it kind of getting lost in the background here. The worst thing you could do here is make all of these trees the same value. So they're all the same level of dark, same level of light, because that'll look like they're all exactly lined straight. Where if you make some a little bit brighter, some a little bit darker, it'll push some in front, some behind, and you'll get a much more interesting effect. And that's the current goal. If you start to get a little bit of a chalky application and your strokes are all getting a little bit large, remember to just add a little bit of extra water to your mixture. This will make things sharp and smooth again. It'll make things a little bit more transparent, but I think that's worth the benefits. There we go. Looks nice. Looks really nice. This will really start getting lost much earlier on than these because it is in that lighter pigment. And we do have it a bit darker right there. Something I might do is I might take a pigment that's similar to what we have in the background and I'll just test it to make sure that we actually have similar color, similar value rather. Just keep making it brighter. And I might de-extend some of these branches and just make them look a little bit smaller, because this tree's farther away, which means the branches are visually going to look smaller because they're pushed back. Perspective is going to have its hand in this. So that's also an important thing to consider when you're creating depth and realism. It's perspective. How far away is your subject from your point of view in the painting? The farther and farther away it is, the smaller it should be painted. So this one, it's a little bit farther away than these other trees, so the branches will branch out a little bit less extensively. So here I'm just going back and I'm adding that mid to light tone value that we had back there. And I'm just simplifying. Again, it's harder to take branches out than it is to add them in. So if in your first application you just make them a little bit smaller, it'll probably be easier. But this also just goes to show you that, you know what, even if it's on there, you can fix things quite simply, and it is okay. There we go. I think in the end, this one turned out really nicely. Now we'll move on to this big one. It's the closest to us, it will have the widest reach, it'll have the most texture and detail, and it'll be the darkest. So I'm grabbing some extra Mars Black for this. I'll start out at the end of the application, and then I'll work my way inwards through this little tap effect. Remember, this is how you get all of the detail that you can only really see close up in a painting. Being a little bit loose, but I'm still considering where I'm going and the fact that I'm making things change progressively. I'm not trying to aim for that same stroke or application over and over. Still want diversity. The more of these you do, the better at it you will become, which is also why we start with the ones in the background that are less stark, because they act as a great warm-up for these ones right here. Creating little sub-branches from some of these larger branches. That's another good detail you can add to the ones that are, again, a little bit closer to us in the painting. Now, my brush is very wet at this point, so that I get those nice, clean little marks. But at the cost, it is fairly transparent, so I'm not getting that dark pigment that I have mixed on my palette or my brush. Instead, it's mixing with the lighter gray, at least optically, that we already have on the canvas. So I'm having to go back a couple of times and reapply. But we're definitely getting there. It's just taking a little bit longer, and that's okay. We're all here because we enjoy painting and taking our time. It's not a bad thing. I call these hour-long lessons. I always intend for them to be hour-long lessons, but I think generally they end up being 2 minutes. They end up being 2 minutes, and it's fantastic. We save a lot of time. No, we aim for them to be an hour, but I've noticed, I think 3 of them so far in a series of maybe 10 have been 2 hours and 39 minutes. And I don't know why that number keeps happening, but it is apparently going to maybe be the standard. But I'm not going to change the series to 2 hours and 39 minute paintings, right? So we'll keep aiming for an hour. Maybe I'll get more quick. But I also I urge you to take your time with these. Have some fun. Don't stress about it. Learn at your pace. Redo things if you need to. Continue to play with values and colors and all of that. And we will get to playing with colors relatively soon. There we go. Looks great. Now I'm going to switch over to the medium-sized flat-headed brush and fill in this area right here. I'm going to make it a little bit darker than what we have currently on there. So take a good amount of Mars Black, a hint of titanium white. Just create this darker bush that's presenting itself here in the foreground. Remember, we like to begin with the outskirts, and then we work our way inwards. And I'm also not just continuously dragging it as far as I can. I'm going back and I'm grabbing more paint, because that will give me a much better layer. There we go. And then these bushes will come out to about there. It's not all bushes, some of it's kind of an ivy growing and a little bit of grass, different things like that. But we kind of covered it all in that, and then we can go back and add the details with some added light. So for that added light, I'm switching over to the smaller flat-headed brush because it's great for that detail work. We did it all in here. We're going to do that again right in here. So just take some extra titanium white, move that into the almost Mars Black mixture. Add some hints of foliage, little leaves protruding. And I'm doing them all on this side because the light's coming this way. So this side will be much darker. It won't have those same highlights. So I can begin by applying them to this edge, and then I work my way in, and as I do, it dissipates, it blends with this darker pigment we currently have on the canvas, and it subsides. Now, of course, because we're mixing it on top of a very dark, still wet pigment, it turns much more gray. It's not the bright pigment we have, or the relatively bright pigment we have on the palette. So we'll have to go in a couple of times, add in these highlights. It's nice right now, we're getting these very subtle transitions and blends because that pigment is still wet. But it just means, again, it's another process that'll take a little bit more time, and that's okay. Here it'll dip down, and then it'll come back up. So it kind of moves like this. And you know what? I didn't have this as part of the initial plan, but I think we'll put in some rocks in here as well. So I'll just take this slightly lighter pigment, I'll create an edge, blend it back down a little bit, create another edge there. These will be quite lost in the bushes, so they won't be receiving much highlight, so I'm not going to make it very bright. Do another one right there. Here's another. And then I'll add some foliage around them. There we go. Really love how this is turning out. Now it's that time of the painting where, yet again, we put our brush down, we stand up, we take a couple of steps back. Let's give it an honest evaluation. Let's not do a quick look. Give it 1, 2, 3 minutes. Make sure everything is progressing the way you want. At this point, this should be the darkest point in the painting. This should be the brightest. This should be kind of the second brightest. This is more variations of grays, but this is the darkest area of this side. So just make sure that's all in check. If it's not, change it up, have some fun, maybe go back in the video. But you could also take the reference photo and make it black and white in Photoshop or whatever your editing software is to see just how these values should progress. But from there, we'll come back in, we'll fix anything up if we need to, and if we don't, we'll come in and we'll work on this. Then once that's done, we get to work on the moose. Once that's done, we get to add some color, and then we'll have a really wonderful painting. So, again, I'm going to take a 2-3 minute break, give it an honest perspective, give it an honest look at the perspective, and then we'll get back into it. After stepping back, I see one main edit I would really like to make, and that is making this edge and this a little bit darker. I want it to match this to a point, just a little bit. So I'm going to take my medium-sized flat-headed brush, put this back over here, make a nice dark Mars black mixture. I'll test it in here. Feel like that's a nice version of it. And I'll throw this at the bottom in the rocks initially. Just like so. Just add a little bit of extra value in here. I'll work it up around there. Kind of splash it about. And apply that same texture that we did before. Now this is fairly wet. I have a lot of water on here, so I have a lot of control of what I do with it. Can kind of blend it with my finger, make this kind of soft transition. I can just use my wet brush to continue, kind of tapping upwards in the way that we do. But I really like the added contrast. I'm going to darken a couple of these rocks a little bit, that way it doesn't look like they're really standing out and shining in this area. And then I'll also take a little bit of it, throw it into our tree here, and the bottom limbs. There we go. And I just want it in the foreground here. I don't want it extending out into the background at all. There we go. Now yet again, I'll take some steps back and give it an honest evaluation. So I feel like that came along really well. Now we can move on to this larger area. And this is an area which I'm going to begin with the larger flat-headed brush because it is so large, but I'm probably going to switch to the medium or the small-headed brush for some detail relatively quickly. So I'm going to begin by working in this area. In this area right here, it's going to be quite dark because it has all the shadows from this. And as we move out, it gets lighter and lighter as we kind of get out of the shadow here. As we get over here, we'll get more of a mid to light tone that we have in there. So I'm going to begin with the darkest values. I'm going to take that Mars black. I'm going to grab a hint of titanium white. And I just added some additional titanium white to this. What I had left was fairly diluted, and I wasn't really going to get any bright values out of that anymore. So when you start to run out of your pigments on your palette, do try to apply new pigments there, because you don't want to be collecting dirty or pigments, colors you don't actually want. So with that, here I'm just beginning on the edge, as you can see. I'm doing a little bit of this tapping motion. It's quite dark, probably much more dark than I want. I don't want it to be as dark as the moose, So I'm going to take some titanium white, I'm going to move that in, and we'll try that from here. And that's definitely better. I like this for our darker value. As I get around the mousse, I'm going to use the sharp edges of the brush to work my way around the mousse. There we go, being very delicate. Just because it's a big brush doesn't mean you can't be delicate with it. We can go back in and touch all of this up when we actually paint the mousse later. But right now I just want a relatively good cutout here. There we go. Okay, now we'll continue over here. Make it a little bit darker. Create that nice edge for the landmass and the waterfall. Create that nice edge around its leg and foot, hoof. There we go. And now it's much more smooth sailing. So we can start to fill this in. As you can see, I'm almost out of paint. Don't start to just kind of take from other areas. You can see when I do that, I just kind of rip that paint off, and now we have this area that doesn't have much paint in the middle. Instead, take more Mars Black, more titanium white. This is a large area. We are committing to using a good amount of paint. It's a little bit too dark. Grab some more titanium white. Still a little bit dark. Grab more titanium white. Just trial and error, and there we go. And we're just painting this initially with a little bit of a gradient. Again, it's darker as we get into the shadows, and then as we get out here, it gets a little bit brighter. But I don't have much texture or detail happening. We will incorporate that relatively soon. Now, I have this little area of my drawing that kind of has this drop inland that's going to be a bit darker because it's not facing the light. So I'm just going to avoid that right there and work my way over to the left-hand side of the painting. If this kind of blends into the back here, that isn't a bad thing at all, because they should be touching and it'll feel nice and cohesive if they do. I'm going to make this a little bit darker as we get towards this corner, just to create a bit more of a vignette. And then I'm going to work my way around this running water. Doesn't have to be perfect, I just want to remember where it is. There we go. Leaving the water areas white, and I'm covering all of the rock area. Now this is a little bit of a dip, which means it's facing this way, the light is facing this way, which means this has almost no light touching it. It's all just going to be reflective and atmospheric light. So here, I'm going to make it significantly darker. I have my Mars Black, creating this little pocket, this little falling area, these nice darker pigments. And I'll throw a little bit of that over here as well. Again, just make that edge darker. So now we have a relatively flat ground area. I want this to be rock. So what I'm going to take a step back, just make sure that the gradient works the way I want it to. It's nice, it has some like slight highlights there, and then it gets darker, and then it gets into this mid-tone, and then it gets darker. And because it's not flat, it looks much more realistic. It looks like it has movement in it, and that's a great thing. So, getting back to it, I'm going to now take my medium-sized flat-headed brush because it can deliver some detail and some sharp, intricate detail. Going to get a little bit of our really dark mixture. And I'm going to create some other little shelves that are happening in this rock. So it's coming, and then it's dipping, and then it's going forward, and then it's dipping, and this is a big dip. So this will be a smaller dip, but it'll be a bit longer. Here's another one. And then we can have little dips and little rocks over here. So I'm just doing little tapping motions, connecting areas. I'm doing a tap and a drag here and there. And this is just creating little impressions in the rock that aren't going to be receiving as much light because they dip down and then you can't see them in that little pocket. So some connect and create these lines and others are just singular. And I'm trying to kind of dance around with my brush, create lots of these little implications and options. Don't forget to get some around the feet. It's easy to say that that's a detailed area and we don't want to hinder it, so we just don't go near it, but that won't give you the best effects. Here I'm just going back, I'm doing just so many. It's a very subtle change of value from what we initially had, which is good, because if it was a stark change in value, then it would really pop. It would look like this polka dotted checkered effect. But because it's so close, it's just this nice little texture that we add in to the ground and to the rock. And I'm just continuously doing it until I get something that feels really nice and cohesive. There we go. Now I switch to my smallest flat-headed brush. Create a bit of a highlighted version. Take some titanium white, move that in. I'll take my pinky finger, put it in a dry area of the canvas. Make sure that your pinky is also dry. Remember, I was using my fingers to blend a little bit of that paint. If they are still wet, that will go onto your canvas and it can hinder things. So make sure that it's dry, make sure what you're putting it on is dry. But here I'm just kind of balancing my hand. And then I'm going to paint in some of this falling water here. Farther away from the light, so it doesn't need to be as bright as the actual waterfall. There we go. Going quite well. I'm going to take a step back. I think what I want to do is brighten up some of the moving water in here. Not by much, but just a little bit. So take some extra titanium white. Apply that to more of the top areas and the areas that are a little bit more flat. So not the falling areas necessarily, but the areas that might catch a little bit more light. Keep it fairly subtle in the back here. Not applying much at all. And now we get to go in and add a little bit more texture to the rock. Hypothetically, this rock is dewy, it's misty, it's wet, it has a little bit of a sheen to it. So I'm going to take some of that highlight. I'm going to start along the edge of one of the little shelves. And with this little tapping effect, I'm going to add just the smallest hints of highlight. And then I'm going to start working them back in the painting a little bit, creating this extra texture and detail. This is the same thing we did with that darker pigment, except now it's a little bit brighter. And because we're doing these multiple layers, some darker, some lighter, we are just continuing to build up all of these little impressions in the rock here and giving it a lot of detail, texture, character, personality. Just like so. Having this highlight pigment right next to these shelves is also really going to bring them out, make them look a little bit more poppy, noticeable, and that can be kind of nice as well, being that they are in the foreground and this is where we want the viewer's attention. So I'm going in with different levels of highlight. In the end, with this effect, we could also add some blue over top it at the very end and make it look like there's just the thinnest amount of water moving over this rock, which could be a really beautiful effect. And then here we have the real water rushing through the crevices and deeper areas, the channels. Being a little bit quiet here just because I'm trying to concentrate, make sure that I'm not making the same stroke repetitively. There we go. We wanted to get slightly more simple as we move into the distance, into the background, because as it gets farther away, the eye can't pick up on that detail to the same extent. So I'm actually going to leave this fairly barren, and I'm going to come back and make this a little bit more simple as well. So I'll just take a little bit of extra Mars Black, work that into our brighter mixture, and then I'll create some longer strokes here in the back rather than the short little taps, and this will help me simplify it a little bit. There we go. We can also create a little bit of a highlight to run down some of these shelves, just to show that there is now more of a vertical movement to it and what's occurring. Also give it the impression of water should we want to go over it with that blue layer. Going to go in and make this area a little bit darker as well, just to show that it's also a dip. And we'll incorporate this over here as well. Wasn't something that was in the initial reference photo, but just kind of an artistic liberty I found and wanted to play with. That's okay. Encourage you to, even when you're using reference photos, add little pieces of you to the painting as well. There we are. Quite nice. Now yet again, taking a step back, looking at it, making sure I like what it's turning into. I think that's a really great bottom area so far. Though now that we have this little step, we need to adjust how the water moves. So I'll just add that right there. We can add some water that's falling. Maybe it'll pool a little bit more here. Yeah, that worked well. Worked out really well. Again, this is all included in the actual traceable. I did work off the finished version of that, or of this for that. Which means I didn't actually work on it yet. I am going to once this painting is done. Here I'm just adding in some extra falling water, kind of trickling in from the sides. Really nice. Just trying to find ways to add extra details, because those are really what's going to sell this and the more realism of it. It's having those little things that are in the background. There's extra little thoughts. They're not the big parts of the composition, but they do play a role, and an important one in the end. There we go. Okay, so from there, I'm going to move back onto my moose, and we're just going to add some highlights to him to give him some dimension. So I'm going to take some medium gray, like you can see right here. Going to apply this to the top of his back. Going to work along that edge. And then I'm going to work it down a little bit with little strokes to make it look like maybe it's the hint of fur. Just like so. And this is predominantly on his back because that's where the light's hitting. This area right here, almost no light is getting to it, right? We can also add some light up here on the antlers. Some light on the side here. It's really nice. There we go. So I'm just applying it to the tops, and then I'm wrapping it back down. Trying to have it dissipate. That way that light is just subtly changing. Here it's kind of a hard line. I'm going to take a wet brush. I'm just going to work over that. Can peel off a little bit of the paint with my finger. And if it gets too bright at any point, we can go back in with the darker mixture and work on that. In the end, none of the moose should actually be a pure Mars black like what we painted it initially with the silhouette. We should go back over all of it with a slight gray, as this will pick up color a little bit better, create a little bit more depth. So there I just added the smallest hint of gray. We can add a little bit of a highlight onto the leg. This one too. And then I'll blend it out so it isn't so bright and noticeable. Remember that this side doesn't have much light at all. There we go. Then I'll just kind of sharpen up the bottom areas, the legs that have a couple little applications over them from the ground area here. Fix that up. And I will also just take a bit of that dark pigment and fix up the edges for the waterfall in the distant background. Just create some vertical lines here. Clean that up. Now, I think this is what I want for the base layer, the achromatic layer. I think the next step is glazing, but give me a minute to take a couple of steps back, give it a good look, make sure that the values are how I want, and I have some time to make some adjustments should we need to. But I think this is coming along really well. So I took a couple of steps back, and I'm glad I did because I do see a couple of changes I'd like to make before we start glazing. Once we start glazing, we essentially want all of our values to be exactly how we want them. So this is the time to go back in, make the changes we want to. And something I noticed is this is incredibly dark, this is incredibly dark, but this is the true foreground. This is what's closest to us. And this should have the arguably darkest values, maybe tying with the moose. So I'm going to take my smallest flat-headed brush. I'm going to mix up a really dark gray. I'm going to test it on the moose, make sure that it's similar there, and then I'm going to bring it down into this area right here. And as you can see, it's getting darker, it's creating some extra depth, it's much more stark now. I'm trying to avoid the little bits of water that may be falling / bits of rock that catch light. Again, I'm not really sure what I want to do with this yet, but we will learn soon. And it's okay to not know. To kind of just play with things until they work out the way you want. There's so many options you have when you do a painting. It's good to keep the mind open. Here I'm just throwing a little bit more of that really dark pigment into the ground in these little dips. That way this looks a little bit more natural, a little bit more cohesive. There we go. Okay, so yet again, I'm going to stand up, take a couple of steps back, and see if that fixed it. So as I stepped back, I realized this is really just what I want. I felt like that added so much more depth to it. I really feel like it is a proper full painting now. And this is essentially the finished version of our achromatic version of the painting. So our version in black, white, and gray. Though I am going to add color, I'm going to do so soon, I would like to note, on these videos, I do occasionally get comments saying, I really liked it before you added color, and that is wholly reasonable. A black and white painting can be incredibly beautiful. You do not have to add color, and if you're apprehensive about it, if you're unsure about it, if you really love what you have right now, just watch the next segment, don't necessarily follow along, and if you end up really liking it, if you like the technique, then add that color, but you certainly do not have to. Again, a black and white painting can be a great painting. So, with that said, I am going to start my glazing layer next, but I'm going to explain glazing in just a minute, but before we get into glazing, what you need to know is that you need completely clean water, because this is black, white, and gray, and it will dilute your colors. It will make them less vibrant. So make sure that your water is entirely clean. The same goes for your brushes. Wash them all incredibly well. You don't want that black and white mixing in with the colors and diluting them. And finally, you need to absolutely make sure that your canvas is entirely dry. We're going to be working with very wet layers, and if we were to apply those to a canvas that is semi-wet, we're just going to rip off all that paint that we currently have. If we let it dry fully, then those very wet layers will just rest on top. But it will hinder and damage the painting if we do so while it is still wet. Now acrylics, they don't take a long time to dry. It'll probably take 15-20 minutes, just enough time for me to clean everything and get all of my colors ready. So I'm going to take a 15-20 minute break. I would advise you to do the same thing if you intend on moving on to the glazing process. And at this point, clean your brushes, clean your palette, clean your water dish, and I will be back with a fully dry canvas. I will have new colors on my palette, which we will talk about. We'll talk about how to do the glazing, and then we will actually do the glazing. So, I'm really excited. I think this is going to turn into an absolutely fantastic painting, and I will see you in just a minute, thanks to the powers of video editing. So we are now back. The canvas is entirely dry to the touch, which it needs to be for this next step. We have clean water, we have clean brushes, and a variety of paints here on the palette. That said, you don't need all of these paints. All you really need is a white, a yellow, a blue, a brown, and a black. Here I have titanium white, primary yellow, cadmium yellow, deep hue. This is just to have a little bit of a darker, richer yellow. Then I have a cerulean blue, primary blue will do just fine. This is a burnt umber, a burnt sienna, and then a Mars black. So what we're going to do now, we're going to take our large flat-headed brush because it can cover a lot of space. We're going to make sure that it's very wet, and then we're going to apply all of this water to our paints. And we're going to thin them out to the point where they're essentially like watercolors. Then we're going to apply them on top of our painting, and because there'll be such thin layers, we'll just be applying color. We won't be changing the values, we won't be changing the line work, everything else will remain as it should, and that's why we paint with the achromatic palette, so we can break it up into two different steps. The first being handling value, handling depth, creating all of these three-dimensional subjects. The second being just adding the color and knowing that it'll work well. So again, it's meant to make it easier. This is going to be quite fun. It's always very cathartic because we just get to play. But essentially, we are going to mix these to the point where they are like watercolors. We're going to use water to do so because it's a medium that we use throughout the entirety of the painting. The more we use it, the better we'll get at it. However, you can go out and buy actual mediums for this. I just haven't found it necessary, and I feel like we can do a really good job with the water that we have here. So before we begin, we take a couple of steps back. We just make sure the painting is exactly how we want it. And then once we are certain, we get into it. So I'm going to begin in the background, as we always do. Here I'm going to take some cerulean blue, move it out into my palette. I'll take a hint of titanium white, just to thicken it up a little bit. That said, we want to make this incredibly thin. So now I'm going to take a lot of water, and I'll move that out onto my palette over what we currently have. Just like that. See? It's acting like water, not like acrylic paint. Then, I'm going to take this. I'm just going to apply it up into my sky, atop just about everything. And I'm going to start blending it down over that first set of trees and everything else. Now when you first apply it, as you can see, it'll be pretty saturated. But as you move it out on the painting, it gets less and less so. So here you see it's getting much more soft. You see the gray much more behind it. Here I'm going back to grab a little bit of water. If it starts to dry, just add more water to your brush and then come back. Here I'm applying it over my trees here in the foreground, a little bit over my waterfall. I want to avoid it for the most part around the moose. So I'm trying to work around that. I'm still using those nice sharp edges. And I don't want there to be too much blue up here, so I'm just going to add some extra water and move that away from the top of the painting. Here you can see if you apply pressure with the brush and you work back and forth with the head of it, you can move a lot of that paint out of areas. Now it creates these streaks, but that's fine because we can take a relatively dry brush or damp brush and then just go back over it. But now you can see that the top is much more subtle than it was a second ago. And we can just keep moving it out until we have that subtle effect that we want. It's very forgiving. It allows you to play a lot, but it's also something that can feel a little bit overwhelming the first time. So go slow with it. Recognize that you can take paint off, but don't apply too much to begin with, especially if this is your first time glazing. Work at it at a reasonable pace. Slowly apply it until you get what you want. And I really like that. I think that is a nice subtle amount of blue. I'm going to work a little bit more here into the foreground, or into the midground rather. Work some in between the moose's legs and around the edges. If that means going over the moose a little bit, that is okay. We will be adding our own color to the moose. That's just a good way to start. Then I'm going to add some green. And we can make a green in two different ways. We can mix this cerulean blue with this cadmium yellow deep hue, or this primary yellow. This is going to give us a much more lush green. This is going to give us a much more rich, warm green. So I'm going to start with the primary yellow, and I'll just move that out here on my palette. I'll grab a hint, just a little bit of the cerulean blue. Cerulean blue is a much stronger pigment, and it will quickly overwhelm the yellow. So if you want it to be a green rather than a blue, use much more yellow than blue. Mix that out. Now I'll make it very watery. And now I'll apply this in my foreground, as you can see. And the value and the detail and the texture, it all remains. It looks great. We're just adding this extra layer. Now this is a misty day. It doesn't have all of the sunlight. I don't want it to be too bright. So I'm actually going to take my cadmium yellow deep hue, my cerulean blue, mix those two up. You see it's a much darker, much more rich green, and then I'll add a hint of Mars black, which will change the value to be a little bit darker, but it will also mix with the cadmium yellow deep hue to make it a little bit more olivey. And I'll apply that here at the back. Now I feel like the green went a little bit farther than I wanted, so I'll just take some water and I will move that out of that general area. When we apply it and then we kind of take it off like this, we make it still there, but it's so much more subtle, which can be really nice, especially in a misty, foggy painting. There we go. I'm just throwing a little bit of green here into the background. Can run it over my rocks there. They can have some moss on them. And then I can strip it off with some extra water, should I want to. Now, when we stripped off that green, we also stripped off some blue, so I'll throw that back up there. And I'll even bring that blue back down into the green a little bit. There we are. Now I'm going to take a couple of steps back, just see how it's progressing. So far, so good. There's a little bit of a line here, but there's so much water in that area right now. If I were to go over it with paint or more water, it would essentially just keep moving it out of that area. So I'm going to let that dry before I get back into it. Instead, I'll take some of this blue that we have, take a little bit more, just like so. I'll add that back into these trees. Now, of course, that's very saturated, much more so than the sky. Probably too much so, so I'm just going to work it farther back, work it out, that way it becomes lesser. And a good tip is to not move it out towards the sky, but to move it away from the sky. That way you don't get a line of blue up near the sky, kind of like we did there with the green. Looks like it's dried a little bit, so I can probably come back in, steal a little bit of that green off again. Yes, that's working quite well. See, it's quite forgiving. I'll go back to some blue and work that over it again. I'm being very soft with my brush, so that way I don't get brush strokes everywhere. And now we'll move over to the green here. And for this, I'll use a combination of both of our yellows. In the end, I realized that's what I liked best over there. So both yellows, a little bit of cerulean blue, hint of Mars black. Again, this will darken the value a little bit, but I think it gives it that nice, rich, foresty green. There we go. So I'll start by applying this to the bottom here, over my bushes. Just like that. And then I'll start moving it up over some of the foliage, just covering the areas we've already applied with the corner of the brush. I'm going to be fairly careful in not getting it too much in the sky. If you wanted to spend some time, you could do this with a smaller flat-headed brush and you get a much more detailed application. I'm okay with it looking a little bit more loose. Again, I do like that painterly effect. And this will definitely give us a little bit of that. And then I'm going to move a little bit of this green off so it's less saturated. Moving it down rather than up. Remember, we can cover our rocks a little bit and then just scrape it off at the end. Can take paint off with our hands. You can see the gray really coming out again. It's because we don't need that much of an application in this type of piece. We do want it to be a little bit more subtle. Here I'm running a little bit of that green up. It's looking nice. Take that green off the rocks a little bit. There we go. Now, yet again, standing up, taking a couple of steps back, seeing how it's progressing. It's getting a really realistic effect because we're going for those more subtle palettes. Here I'm just going to take a little bit of green out of the sky. You can take green out of the sky if the sky is entirely dry. So you might want to do the blue in the sky first, let it fully dry, and then come in and do the green. You will have more control. But it isn't entirely necessary. I didn't fully let it dry, and I'm still having a relatively good effect here. There we go. Something else to consider is your water. How wet it is. No, that doesn't make any sense at all. How colorful, how pigmented it is. If it's very green or very blue and you go in to do a wash with a yellow, when you dip your brush into that water, it will turn into a green because the blue or the blue in the water or the green in the water will mix with the yellow pigment on the brush and they will mix to make a green. So right now I'm working with fairly green water, so when I go back over this fairly blue sky, I might accidentally be working a little bit of that green into there. So it's something to consider. It won't make the biggest effect generally, but if you're switching from color to color and it's a dramatic change, I do recommend changing your water. With that, I'm not going to work with any stark yellow, so I'm fairly confident in moving forward from here. Next, I'm going to take a little bit of my burnt umber, move that out here on my palette. Make sure that's nice and watery. and I'll apply that to the rock down here. And I'm going to use a very minimal amount. I don't want it to be a saturated brown. So you can see I'm just working in little bits. And this is generally how I'd advise to do most painting. Mix little amounts, apply little amounts. If you like what you are working on, if you like how it's turning out, go back in and apply more. There we go. Our mousse is also going to have a lot of this burnt umber on him. So I'm just working that on top. There we go. Nice to have a little bit of color. This area down here is going to be water, so we'll take some blue. Make it nice and watery. You can tell that it's still going to be a blue when I mix it here because I did grab that water. It's a blue here, it's not a green, so I'm still safe. But if you feel like when you go to mix that and you no longer have that color that you grabbed from, then it's time to clean your water and your brush. It's a nice little detail. There we go. That's fairly saturated, which makes sense. The closer you get in the painting to your main subject, the more saturated it's going to become. So I'll take a step back, see if it looks natural. It still looks a little bit too much. So you know what, I'm going to strip a little bit of this off. Just give it that slight hint of the blue. There we go, much better. Just a friendly reminder that subtlety is key, and if you feel like you've stripped off too much, it's always easy to go back and add another layer. You can do it while the paint's still wet, or you can do it when it's dry later on. So it's one of those things you really don't have to rush into a lot of paint. It can happen slowly as you learn with it. So now I'm going to switch over to my smallest flat-headed brush. I'm going to do a glaze with this really nice burnt sienna. It's like burnt umber, but it has a little bit more red and orange in it. It's a bit of a warmer pigment. And I'm going to throw this on my mousse here. Make him stand out a little bit more. Really beautiful. That's why I wanted two different types of browns, so I could differentiate the ground from the mousse. I feel like there's a little bit too much saturation happening around the nose, so I'm just adding water, peeling off a little bit of paint. And then I'll use regular burnt umber with a hint of cadmium yellow deep hue for the antlers, just to give it something a little bit different. Now I'm going to take some steps back. It's coming along well, and this is more of what I intended it to look like initially. My reference photo had this being this brown, and I think it's quite nice. But what I really want from it is more water. I want it to look like there's a little bit of water just moving on top of all of this. There are these larger streams in these larger areas, but the idea that there's also this really beautiful green reflection in the water and the blue from the sky down on there, I think it'll be a really nice addition. So let's do that. I'll take this cerulean blue and I'll apply it on top here with the brown. I'm not doing too much of it. I do want it to be subtle. I do want it to work in conjunction with the brown rather than completely taking it over. There we go. I'm going to take a little bit of green throw in a bit of a reflection from these colors and these ones as well. So we're not using much color in the painting, but we're really moving our color around. We have blues in the trees, we have greens in the water and the reflections. We have two different types of browns. It's a lot of blue right there. I don't know that I want that much. That said, we can always go back in and add more brown. Just like that, until we find that balance we're looking for. Now, when you do a lot of layers of glazes, eventually they can disrupt your initial values. So I did kind of lose the legs in there a little bit, so I'll just take a little bit of Mars Black, burnt umber, hint of titanium white, maybe a little bit of burnt sienna. Mix up a nice darker mixture there. And then repaint in this nice thick layer for his feet. There we go. Can move this throughout a little bit as well, in the areas in which we feel the value will make sense. Quite nice. Now I'm going to take a couple of steps back. Oh no, I'm not. I'm just going to move out this little line of blue a little bit. A very wet brush. Just caught that. Now I'm going to take a couple of steps back, see how it's progressing and what I want to do with it. So as I stepped back, I realized that I wanted a little bit more green up in here. So I'm going to take that larger flat-headed brush, grab hints of what we already have, start it down here, that way it doesn't start with a patch of green, and then I'm just going to blend that all the way up, like so. Again, nice and easy. Then I want to add a little bit more highlight down here, because we have a lot of water and it's still going to be catching light and kind of having this little shine to it. So I'll take a little bit of titanium white, move it into my cerulean blue, and then I'll do these little taps down here, which will create some added detail, highlight. It'll be the light catching the water, reflecting. And this is something I didn't know that I wanted until we decided to make this watery, right? Because the rock wouldn't have such a reflection like this, and so it wouldn't have such a bright value like this. So this is one of those things that comes in time. And then as I get over to the right-hand side, I'm going to stop, let it dissipate, because here we have a lot of shadow, so it's not going to be catching that much light, and it's not going to be bright to that same extent. I'm not going to add all of that detail in the background either. Remember to let it dissipate as we get farther away that way. Now we do need to give our little guy an eye here. So just take some titanium white. I'll grab a little bit, maybe cadmium yellow deep hue. And I'll just throw that in there. Kind of neat, kind of very, very stark. We should tone that down. I'll take some of the mixture that we used for the mousse itself, and I'll just apply that in there. There we go, that made it much more subtle. We can take some Mars Black, make a very dark version of it. Add in a little nostril there. And we can continue playing with the value by making the underbelly a little bit darker. So you can just keep improving the paintings. Take a little bit of extra time. There we go. Going to make a bit more of that bright blue. Tap some hints in there. Some areas that are kind of pooling more, like this. And then I'll throw a little bit more of that in here. It is saturated. It is a bit brighter. But I just want it to be a little bit more poppy here in the foreground. Can take some regular blue. Work that through here. We can also blend it out into our glaze. The more water we add, the more we can thin it. See there, it actually dripped. That can be a great effect. There we are. Again, going to take a couple of steps back, look at it for a minute or two, and decide what I want to do from here. As I continue to paint, I realize I really like the hints of blue there, but some of them are just a little bit too messy, so I'm going to clean up a couple, and then I will throw in a couple more with a little bit more deliberate application. So I'm thinking about where I'm applying them, that way they don't get too repetitive or too big. They don't stand out too much. Again, I'm kind of going back to the tops of these steps. And I don't want them to be too stark. So if they're incredibly bright in an area, I'm going back over them a second time with a lot of water. And this is going to allow that color to continue, but in a less prominent way. There we go. I'm going to add a little bit of brown over here, give us a little bit more dry land. Have it be a good combination of the two. Kind of looks like it's coming from over there and getting on top of these lower levels, but as it gets higher, it doesn't manage to do so. Just an extra little detail to think about. Going in and adding some green to this water because this water over here isn't a pure blue. A lot of it does have that reflective quality. Water can just be touching this foot right here. Creating a really nice, neat piece. Now I'm going to throw in some extra mist using the medium-sized round-headed brush, but to do that I need to clean my water very well, otherwise my mist will be green because my water is green. So I'm going to take a quick 2-minute break and then I'll be right back. Now, I said I was going to clean my water and then add some mist, but upon stepping back, I think I realized what I really wanted to add to this was a little bit more color. And I'm going to do that through flowers. I'm going to take my smallest round-headed brush, and for this we're just going to use the corner of the brush, as that will give us the sharpest implication. We're going to take some of our cerulean blue, some of our titanium white, and then over here, in the bushes, I'm just going to pop in a couple really small, delicate flowers. Can do some over here, As I get farther and farther away, they need to become smaller and smaller. So instead of tapping on lots of different petals, I might just do one little tap and try to make an interesting application. So rather than it being a perfect circle, I try to make it something else. But this is just a great way to throw in a little bit of extra color and detail into a painting once you start to get to the end. I don't like to do it too early on because it can become very visually distracting. But once you know how much room you have to play with visually, it can be a great addition. So we added a bunch of really nice ones over there. We can throw a couple over here. Trying to make them really small because this is so far away. Just around our rocks. Just like that. There we go. Just a couple pops of color. Now I'm going to take a little bit of Mars Black, a little bit of Cerulean Blue, and a little bit of Titanium White. I'm going to mix up a really light bluish gray. And this is going to be for some birds kind of flying in the distance here. So these are going to be easy. We're just going to make a couple little application strokes there. I know I can make it a little bit darker now that I see that. Just give it this extra little bit of life here in the painting. Maybe do another one up here. Don't forget to add blue to them because they will get a lot of reflected blue light from this sky here. Lots and lots of nice birds in this one. You know what? After stepping back, I look at it and I am very, very happy. Today, I am calling it This is our hour-plus long lesson. It did take a little bit more than an hour, but you know what? I think it was worth it. It was worth the endeavor into the more wildlife-themed landscape. I definitely do intend on doing more of these in the future. In fact, on the wall right now, I already have 2 horses running. I have another one with an elephant, and you know what? We are just going to keep creating content and having a lot of fun. I'm also still working on a cityscape and a mountain range scene, so there's a lot coming. I'm sure I will intermix a couple of other ones in there as well. But this is today's lesson. You can find new lessons, of course, up on the channel every Saturday. And I had a pleasure working on this with you today. If you are a member up over on Patreon at the Alpine level or above, please send me your work over on that Facebook page. I'd love to see it. I think this one could go a lot of different ways and be a really, really neat piece, especially the black and white versions as well. So thank you so much for joining me here today. I really look forward to seeing what you come up with, and I really look forward to doing all of the future paintings as well. So thank you so much for stopping by. I will see you soon with a brand new hour-long lesson. And above all, as always, stay creative.